Sam, and I'm making this video about retrograde planets, and I have behind me a sort of diagram to illustrate what planets look like from a sort of bird's eye view when they go retrograde. Now, when planets are retrograde, they appear to be moving backwards relative to our motion here on Earth, because they are actually closer to the Earth at that time, and based on the speeds of the planets, one appears to be moving backwards. And so it's similar to the phenomena when you're in a car and you're going 70 miles an hour and you pass a car that's going 55 miles an hour. That car appears to be moving backwards. It's not really moving backwards, it's just that you're moving faster. And so the phenomena is the same with retrograde planets, and what happens astronomically in the sky when they go retrograde or appear to move retrograde is they actually are closer to the Earth at that time. And I had this diagram behind me to illustrate that. If this is the Earth, this is like Sun, Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, let's say. In this example, if the planets were lined up like this, every planet would be retrograde at this time, and you can see they would all be closer, closest to the Earth at that time. And what happens is, because Mercury moves faster than the Earth, it appears to go retrograde. Because Venus moves faster than the Earth, it appears to be retrograde. Because the Earth moves faster than Mars, it appears retrograde. Jupiter and Saturn, the same thing. Now, this phenomena also happens when we have Mercury and Venus retrograde. They're also what's called combust, which means they're lost in the sun. They're lost in the rays of the sun. So that's another phenomenon. But when it comes to retrograde, it's when the planets get closer to the Earth, that's when they appear to be retrograde. Now, understanding this astronomy is also important because it gives you insight into why, especially in Vedic astrology, retrograde is considered to be a strength. A certain motional strength is what it's called. When planets are moving slower, they actually get more strength. They tend to slow down and back up, and in fact, when they're retrograde, they become forces of, they become introspective forces where we reflect and ponder the nature of that thing with a lot more, intuition and feeling. So rather than just externally acting and doing something with it externally, it becomes a great force of introspection. Now, all planets go retrograde at one time or another. Saturn is actually retrograde for about 4.5 to 5 months. Jupiter is retrograde about 3.5 to 4 months each year. Mars can go retrograde for also several months at a time, 2 or 3 months at a time. All planets at certain times in their orbits will wind up being retrograde, and at that time we need to reflect upon them. Now, for instance, the nature of Saturn is to be retrograde, as I say, close to half the time. So this quality of Saturn, or all the things that we say about Saturn, about being slow and about making us be thorough and make a commitment, these are all built into that retrograde cycle. Meaning, a lot of the most important qualities of Saturn are also based on the fact that he's retrograde quite a lot. So Saturn, as the planet of duty, commitment, sacrifice for things that we want to grow over time, it's incumbent that those things become forces that we reflect upon almost half the time. Almost half the time we have to be reflecting on what we're making a commitment to and making sure that it's congruent and that there's a lot of integrity behind it. And then the other, let's say, 7 months, we're moving forward with it, then we reflect upon it every for about 4.5 to 5 months, then we move forward with it. Jupiter, those qualities of inspiration, hope, principles, we need to be reflecting on those principles about 1/3 of the time. He's retrograde about 4 months. 4 out of the 8 months, 4 out of the 12 months rather, he's retrograde. This means that things that inspire us, that are principles in our life, so that they don't become dogmas and we don't become just sort of a sort of blind sort of dogma or religion. We're supposed to reflect upon it. Mars areas of life, where we make a commitment to something and work hard. Every couple of years, Mars will go retrograde, 3 or 4 months, and we need to reflect on those things, and then we get clear about our principles and those things we're willing to sacrifice for, and those things that make us strong. So there's a lot of, the specific way that the planet interrupts us or becomes interrupted when it's retrograde has to do with 2 main things. What the planet rules as a karaka, and in particular a living karaka, like the living indicators. Like, for instance, Venus is, our lovers, our partners, things where we find beauty. When Venus goes retrograde, we have to reflect on those things. Those things tend to back up, or we tend to go back and revisit them. And then also what the planet rules as a house ruler. Like, for instance, to use, let's say, Jupiter. Jupiter is the karaka, or the indicator of children, of teachers, those things that give us hope. In the outside world, again, especially as it relates to the living things like teachers, children, but then also whatever houses Jupiter rules in a natal chart. Like if it's Jupiter for a Taurus person, it's the 8th and the 11th house. So when Jupiter goes retrograde, it will interrupt children, gurus, but also large groups of people, because it's because it rules the 11th house. If Jupiter goes retrograde for, let's say, for Gemini, it will also, as I say, interrupt gurus, teachers, children, because that's what Jupiter rules as a karaka. But Jupiter also rules the 7th and the 10th houses for Gemini, which has to do with partners, and then the 10th house of duty and responsibility. So we see these things become contentious when the planet goes retrograde in the sky, and of course when it's in someone's natal chart. Most people have retrograde planets in their natal chart, at least one. Let's say if it's Saturn goes retrograde, it interrupts like authority figures, interrupts old people and your duties and your commitments. And then let's say if Saturn rules the 5th and the 6th house like he does for Virgo, then it also interrupts children and your willingness to focus on your commitments and duties, which has to do with the 6th house. So again, when you look in a natal chart, whatever it is that the planet rules, the houses that the planet rules, those things also become confusing. And so what the retrograde planets do is, instead of having us move forward with those things externally, they tend to become confusing externally. And this confusion around the things that it rules that I just mentioned, what it rules as a karaka and what it rules as a house lord, those things become confusing for the native when it's a natal chart, and that confusion makes the person reflect and question and doubt and have to find the answers in their own heart in a more introspective way. And again, when you look at this diagram, you can see why. If someone has Saturn retrograde in their chart, for instance, it was much closer to the Earth at that time. And by the way, the other thing to notice is when you look up in the sky and you see a planet that's retrograde at any given time, it's very bright. When Jupiter goes retrograde, for example, it gets really bright. When any planet goes retrograde, it gets very bright in the sky. Mars retrograde, like in this example, Mars is exactly retrograde, as close to the Earth as possible. So if someone were to look up in the sky at this time, Mars would be gigantic in the sky. So you can just tell, even by the way the planet looks in the sky, how prominent it is at that time. And so you always want to put yourself in the moment when you're looking at a birth chart, and not just see it as a flat piece of paper. But if someone had, Jupiter retrograde or Mars retrograde, when you looked up in the sky that day and saw Mars, it was big and bright. And again, that becomes a focal point of the person's life, mainly because the things that we try to do with it externally in the world become sources of confusion. And that confusion awakens us to its inner strength and its inner power. This is why it's a strong benefic in Vedic astrology, because Vedic astrology comes from the East, and inner strengths and inner qualities and psychological spiritual forces they tend to be more important and prominent, at least in general, than in the Western world, which is much more materialistic and much more, excuse me, much more materially driven. So any retrograde planet in a natal chart becomes a great source of strength, but it's strength through a sort of struggle, because that thing is not keeping up. Here's a good example. Let's say that you're in the car, and let's say that you're going on a trip, and you have several people going on a trip with you. Let's say it's like in this example, there are 2 or 3 planets that are retrograde, and you're trying to live your life, and it's these 2 or 3 cars. Let's say you're all going on a trip, and there are 2 or 3 cars that are just not keeping up. You have a carload of friends with you. What do you have to do? You have to keep looking back and saying, are they there yet? Where are they? Are they keeping up? And you have to pay a lot of attention to them to make sure that they keep up with the speed of your life. So even if you have a fast car, those planets that are slowing you down might be frustrating, but what they do is they get your attention, and you have to put a lot more attention on those things that are retrograde. So those retrograde planets, they actually demand a lot more of your attention, but in giving more attention, you also notice them more. And, because the analogy of the car is a good one on the surface, but of course our life is much more, deep than that. It's deeper than that, with these universal forces having to pay so much attention to them because of the mistakes that we might make, or other things, winds up bringing us into a much more intimate contact with it, and it becomes a very spiritualizing quality. So it's really important that you understand how retrograde planets work, how each one of them works. Each retrograde planet, of course, is quite different. Not only is it different, because it activates a different quality, because each planet is different, but in particular, you really need to understand what the planets rule. So again, retrograde Jupiter for Aries is completely different than retrograde Jupiter for Taurus, retrograde Jupiter for Cancer, retrograde Jupiter for Gemini. They're totally different because they rule different houses. They're different planets for each ascendant. Not to mention the houses that they go retrograde in, very different. Not to mention if it's in a natal chart or if it's in the sky, very different. So each planet as a retrograde phenomena, or as a retrograde, symbol, opens up an entire, doorway into a new experience. And I actually did a course on retrograde planets several years ago. You can check that out if you want to get some really good training on it, where I go into all the things that I'm actually describing here, not only, the planet in general, retrograde, but I actually analyze each planet for each ascendant, how all those things are different, and it's also a great lesson on the planets as house rulers for each ascendant. But beyond that, it's very important to understand when planets go retrograde in the sky as well, because we're all in contact with the living sky, that however the planet is disposed in our natal chart, like whatever the planet rules, and again, whatever house it's going retrograde in, and all of the phenomena that I just described, that's how the planet is going to influence us personally. And so we hear about Mercury retrograde quite a lot, and it's kind of the one everybody talks about. It's important. They're all important. But in particular, Saturn is very important for recalibrating our commitments. Jupiter for refocusing on what inspires us. Mars for really getting clear about what we're willing to fight and destroy and how to become a better warrior. All the planets are important. And also, by the way, Mercury and Venus, when they go retrograde and combust, is also quite an important thing. So anyway, I just wanted to talk about retrograde planets. I'm going to be doing some more videos about this, actually about each one of the retrograde planets here in the next few days.